Great. Okay, well, our next presenter is Karl Birkeland. Karl, I hope you're in the queue there somewhere. You can turn on your camera anytime. Karl, he's known to many folks, certainly in the US, Canada, and around the world. Started as a ski patroller and has grown into many roles. He currently directs the US Forest Service's National Avalanche Center, and works with the military and other stakeholders in that. Karl's going to talk about some of the work that he's done on snow stability and forecasting with slabs. He's better to talk about that than me. So Karl, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for inviting me. And Brent, I'm having a little problem with the presenter view for some reason. You'll have to remind me. If I go to audience view, is that where I'm supposed to find it? Where I give my presenter?
That would be under the show button. There's a little toggle box underneath in the sharing box.
Sharing box. Ah, okay. Sorry for the delay. Let's see. Are you guys seeing my screen yet?
Yep.
You see your desktop with your chat box.
You're seeing the chat box. Let's see. How about that one?
We have a blue screen there.
Blue screen.
If you click that little arrow and pick lower in the list, it says your presentation name.
Let's see. Is that showing my presentation?
Now we are perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Thanks, Karl.
Yeah. All right. So again, thanks to Joe for the opportunity to attend the meeting and to talk about some of my research. It's really, yeah, I've always wanted to come to the AGM, and I've always been tied up with other things at this time of year. But now that I'm here in my house, like everybody else, I have time, and so it's great to be able to participate. Before I get rolling here, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Alec Van Herwenen, Ben Reuter, and Bastian Bergfeld, and also all the people that helped me with the field work. Now, as practitioners, we know that avalanches are typically easier to trigger during loading. And we also know that snow typically begins to stabilize following that loading. And in science, a lot of what we do is what I call quantifying the obvious. So what I'm going to do in this paper is the questions I want to ask is, what is it about loading that makes avalanches easier to trigger? And then how does the snowpack stabilize after the loading? So we'll start out with this, this relationship here, and don't get too worried about it. This is from some work that Jörg Schweitzer and colleagues did. But essentially, this relationship helps guide the work that I'm going to show you. And you can think of this R sub C. This is really just like a propagation sawtest cut length. So it's your critical cut length, the cut before things self-propagate. This here, you can think of it as the weak layer strength. This other factor here, your slab stiffness, and your load, highly technical, you can think of it as, yes, that's right, the load. So something like new or windblown snow. But essentially what we're saying here is, as the weak layer gets stronger, we tend to have longer cut lengths. As the weak layer as the slab gets stiffer, we'd also have longer cut lengths. If we increase the load, then we'll tend to get shorter cut lengths, and that's what this relationship is. Now, I'm going to talk about two different experiments. In the first experiment, we're going to change the load. We're going to keep these other two factors relatively constant, and we're going to see how changing the load affects our cut length. And then the other experiment will keep the load constant, and we're going to see how these factors change over time. All right, so we developed a technique for adding load to an existing snowpack. It basically involved just disaggregating snow into a cardboard frame. So as you can tell, this is a very high-tech, very expensive procedure based primarily on duct tape and cardboard. And so The first experiment that we're going to do is measure the changes in critical cut length, or this propagation saw test cut length, with increases in load. And so what we would do is we'd take an existing snowpack with an existing weak layer, and then we'd add no new load, 5, 10, 15, and 20 centimeters of snow, and then we do tests on each one of these and see how the addition of more load affects our cut length. And what we see is what you'd expect. On the left axis here, the y-axis, we have the cut length, so the measured critical crack length, or how far you cut before you get that self-propagation. And then on the x-axis here, we have your total stress. So if we go further to the right, we have more stress, so that's when we've added more load to the snowpack. Further to the left on that, less load. And what we see is that all of these lines have a negative slope. They go from higher numbers to lower numbers. In other words, when we have less stress, we end up with longer cut lengths, and as we increase the stress, we end up with shorter cut lengths. And from a practical, from a practical perspective, this makes sense. More snow, or rather more load, the snow tends to be more sensitive to triggering, and we get more avalanches. The second experiment we ran was to look at, or rather to try and measure changes in our critical cut length over time. So this time we're going to keep that load constant, and then we're going to look at the changes in our critical cut length over time, and maybe how that critical cut length is driven by things like the slab stiffness and the weak layer strength. So in this experiment, we added 10 centimeters of snow on top of an existing snowpack. You can see right here, we have a buried layer of surface ore that was buried about another 10 centimeters down. We added 10 centimeters of snow. We did that 32 times around the slope, and then at varying times between 15 minutes and 4 days later, we did propagation saw tests and noted the results. And so this is what our results look like. This on the y-axis is our measured critical crack length, so how far we had to cut to get propagation. And on the x-axis is time. So we have, out here 24 hours, 1 day, 2 days, all the way out to 4 days. And this is essentially what the relationship looks like. In other words, we see the critical crack length increase really rapidly in the first hours after loading, and then a more gradual increase over time. So again, this would be similar to what we might expect to see in stabilization, sort of a more rapid stabilization early on, and then a gentle stabilization, especially because here we're dealing with a buried layer of surface ore. And so our question that we want to ask is this due to the weak layer strengthening, or maybe the slab is getting stiffer? And in fact, our results are showing that it's a little bit of both. So these W's here, we created a model and tried to model this, and the W's represent if we just had weak layer strengthening. The S's represent if we just had slab stiffening, and if we model both of those together, we can get a pretty good relationship between our modeled critical crack length here on the y-axis and our measured critical crack length here on the x-axis. This winter, before I got chased home by the COVID virus, I had the opportunity to work over in Switzerland. And so we tried to repeat some of the same work that we'd done in Montana. And one of the nice things is they have these concrete bunkers not far from the Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research. And the roofs of these concrete bunkers make a great place to do research. This is down in a low river valley. There's a stream that goes by. You get a lot of surface ore forming here, and you can get a nice uniform substrate on these roofs and a uniform snowpack to work with. So when I arrived in Switzerland, this is what the snowpack looked like. We had a great layer of surface ore that was buried just a few centimeters below the surface, but we had no slab on top. And this is what the surface ore looked like. So we had this beautiful layer of surface ore, but no slab. Luckily, we had our technique where we could create a slab. So here we are. In this case, we're actually using a 5mm sieve, and we're sieving it into some cardboard frame. And I'd like to point out some of the differences between doing research in Switzerland versus doing research in Montana. Here in Switzerland, we were using a snow micropen at a cost of about $50,000. We were using a Phantom camera capable of shooting high-speed video at 3,000 frames per second to analyze what's going on mechanically in these tests. But I'd also like to point out that we still had cardboard and duct tape. And this was, according to one person that worked at the Institute, he said it was the first time that he'd seen someone building something out of cardboard to work with their research, but it ended up being the most expedient way to do it, and it was cheap and easy. So anyway, we did these, again, multiple tests. In this experiment, we just were looking at the few minutes and hours after loading. So we actually did tests as short as 4 minutes and then as long as 7.5 hours. And then we'd isolate these tests, and as you can see, we were able to get them nice and clean, and again, filming them at 3,000 frames per second. We did 15 tests over the course of the day. And I'd like to show you some videos, but unfortunately, we can't show the videos on this platform, but we had some very short cut lengths for some of these. This is what the data ended up looking like. These are our critical cut lengths, and this is the time after loading in minutes on the Y or the x-axis here. And you can see that our original cut lengths are as low as 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters, and they increased out to 9 centimeters as we went from 4 minutes out to about 7.5 hours. So pretty nice. We can sort of get an idea of how we're seeing this increase in stability over time. So just to wrap things up a little bit here, again, we're seeing a decrease in critical crack length when we have an increase in the load. So increasing load decreases the critical crack length. That makes sense because when we have loading, in other words, during a storm or after wind loading, that's often when we have more unstable conditions. And then we observed increases in critical cut length over time due to both the stiffening of the slab and the strengthening of the weak layer. And the bottom line is that we had increased stabilization over time, but the rate of that stabilization surely varies depending on the weak layer, the load, the type of slab added, et cetera, et cetera. So in conclusion, one of the practical things that you can do with this research is that anyone can go build one of these frames. You can then add disaggregated snow on top of this, let it sinter for a while, and do tests. And so you can test your existing snowpack to anticipate future stability changes. If you have a weak layer that's maybe buried 10 centimeters down, but it's not very reactive, but you're expecting a big storm to come in quickly, you can actually run some tests and try and see just how more unstable or how rapidly the instability might increase with the added load to the snowpack. And we actually have a couple of folks in the US that are doing this at different avalanche centers just to get an idea of what might be going on. And it's really just going to give you a general idea. You're not going to be able to say, well, with a certain amount of snow, we're going to get avalanches, but you'll get at least a general idea of how that weak layer might react with a load. And with that, I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to present, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Karl. As we get the queue all loaded up, I guess the question that's brewing on my mind is when that cardboard box of yours is going to get its own Instagram account.
Yeah, I should start that one up. That with the dog, you know.
Absolutely. Brent, do we have any questions from the floor?
We currently have no questions from the floor. Now we just got a couple popping up here. Just bear with me. The first one is Brad Acker.
Hi, hi, Karl. This is Brad Acker down in Idaho, National Ski Patrol. My first question, when you're talking about your work in the US, I was wondering about spatial variability and if you tried to block for that or if you thought that was a big deal at all. And then when you went to Europe, now I'm just amazed. I've never seen people doing tests on roofs before. Now I'm wondering, is that going to take off in the US and people that have spots for it?
Well, the work in Montana, we definitely did have there. I mean, there's no way to get away from the fact that we're going to have some amount of spatial variability. But we were doing our tests in relatively uniform meadows, so we had a relatively uniform substrate. We did have a surface or weak layer, so the weak layer was fairly uniform. So it was about as uniform as we can get, but not perfect. One of the things that was interesting about the work in Switzerland is that they're doing some of their other work also on these bunker roofs to help monitor or to help get less spatial variability. But interestingly enough, even on a bunker roof, we could still find spatial variability. You'd have edge effects when you got near the edges. If we had a wind event that came through, we get wind ripples a little bit. So we can't completely get away from it. And that's why one of the contributing factors for having some of the scatter in the data that we have.
All right, our next question is from Brian Lazar, please.
There we go. Sorry, Karl. I'm struggling with the mute button. This one keeps coming up over years, it seems. But if we took the elastic module or the slab stiffness and you anticipated the slab getting less stiff with warming, does it follow that critical crack length would decrease? And have you seen, other than anecdotally, have you poked at that little question there?
Yeah, so the theory would certainly support the fact that having a softer slab or a less stiff slab, we'd see a decrease in the critical crack length. Yes. As far as seeing that with warming, I haven't seen it. I think we do have some evidence of sometimes people seeing the snowpack get more reactive when it gets a little bit warmer. I mean, one of the things that we have to remember is that even when we get warming, it's going to take a while for that warmth to get through the whole thickness of the slab. So even though we might get rather warm temperatures right away, that might only affect the snow surface and not so much that full thickness of the slab.
Thanks, Karl.
Yeah.
Our next question is coming from Sean Zimmerman-Wall, please.
Scott went up too. Yeah, good afternoon, Karl. This is Sean.
Hey, Sean.
Question about this test in relation to the type of weak layer and then the depth of which the test is performed.
Yeah, so with the propagation saw test, kind of an ideal layer is a surface ore layer because it's really easy to keep your saw right in the layer. We've found, at least my own personal experience, and there's probably plenty of people on this meeting that have other experiences with the propagation saw test, and they can weigh in. But my own experience is that with depth hoar, as long as you know at what part of the depth hoar you're getting your fractures to occur, because sometimes we find that the fractures are actually taking place a little ways into the depth hoar. If you can keep it right in that layer, that helps your consistency. With new snow weak layers, like a density change within a slab or something, I find the propagation saw test to be pretty challenging to keep that saw right in, because if you start waffling in and out of the weak layer, then you end up with a lot longer, my experience has been that you end up with a lot longer cut lengths. In terms of the depth of the weak layer, I think a real advantage of the propagation saw test is that you're not reliant on banging on the top of the snow like with a compression test or roosh block extend and column test. And so even with really deep weak layers, you're still getting down to that weak layer and testing it probably a little bit more consistently than you would be if you with one of these tests where you're banging on the top of the snowpack.
Thank you. I look forward.
Yeah.
All right, we still have a couple more questions here. I believe Grant Statham, one of the presenters, may have had a question. He would be next. And then after that, we're going to go to Scott Thumler.
It says his.
Yeah, no question for me.
All right, so then next on the floor is Scott Thumler, please.
Hey, Karl, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Scott.
Hey, good to see you out there. I have a question about, and this is, you might not have the answer, but maybe some of your intuitions about it. Obviously, cutting and isolating a column for a PST sort of changes the slab from, across the three-dimensional terrain. Do you think that there might be some slabs, say stiffer or less stiff or deeper or shallower, where as you cut to do a PST, that PST might be more representative of the natural slab, and then some slabs where it might be more of a change from what you might expect to see in nature? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'll try and answer that. So I think what you're really saying is sort of are there ideal conditions under which the PST might be more representative of what we're seeing in the field versus less representative. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed with the PST is that it really, when you do it, you're cutting on one side of the column, and then you're essentially forcing that fracture to go from that saw blade out toward the end of the column. So you're just forcing it in one direction. Whereas if you have a fracture occurring in the middle of a slope, then that fracture spreads outward from wherever that initiation point is. And it seems to me, at least my experience has been, that sometimes when I'm having, sometimes I'll be getting womping, but I'm not getting very good propagation in my propagation saw test. And I think that might be because when we have situations with a fairly weak slab, but still strong enough to propagate outward in a woomph, but maybe not strong enough to support propagation in sort of that one dimension, driving it along on a propagation saw test. The other thing that I should mention about the PSTs is that it's very difficult to get a really long PST to propagate. One of the things we did in Europe this winter was I went out with Alec, and we tried to do a 9-meter propagation saw test and couldn't get it to propagate. We could get 1 meter, 2 meters, but we couldn't get 9 meters. And Ned Bear has done some research, and he found that he was unable to get propagation saw tests to go longer than about 7 meters. I think that is because you're asking a lot of that slab when you start that propagation in one area to drive it all the way down that block. But then the sort of the mismatch we have between that and what we see in the field is that if we have too short of a test, we have a lot of edge effects related with that. And to get a better picture, we'd want to have a longer test. And in fact, some of their work shows with things of some of my colleagues in Switzerland shows that we really need to be doing longer tests to get an accurate measure of our fracture speeds. So I think with all these things, we just need to understand that there are limitations with these tests. We're trying to get a picture of what's going on. We're trying to get a picture of what's going on over a whole slope with a tiny piece of snow. And it's going to be difficult to get a perfect picture. We can get kind of an index or kind of an indication of what's going on, but we can't get exactly what we want. And so we have to understand that there's limitations with what we're messing around with. That make sense?
Thanks, Karl.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, we have a question from Kevin Marr and then David Miller. Kevin.
Hi, Karl. Kevin Marr, Selkirk Snowcat Skiing. How are you?
Oh, good, Kevin.
Good. It is really cool to hear so many presenters and participants from the United States. Anyway,
Thanks.
Karl, you in your tests, you were testing load and the strength of the weakness. And in one of your tests, I might get the numbers wrong, but you started out after 4 minutes of getting 1 or 2 centimeters, and then after 10 minutes, you got 10 centimeters. How long a study have you done? I mean, you showed 4 days, but I'm curious, especially with surface hoar, how that is going to gain strength over weeks and months as opposed to minutes, and not from 1 to 10 centimeters, but when you get up into the more stable range.
Yeah, no, very good question. So with one of the experiments, we were doing from 4 minutes out to like 7.5 hours, and it went from 1 to 2 centimeters out to 10 centimeters. With the other one, we did from 15 minutes out to 4 days, and it started out at I think 4 centimeters, and then it went out to about 25 centimeters. But the question really is, hey, we're out at 4 days. I mean, we know that when we load a surface hoar layer, we're probably going to be we're probably going to be worried about it a lot longer than 4 days. One of the things that's difficult in terms of the research is that, especially if you're using a weak layer out in the field, if we want to keep load constant and we go out for 3 weeks or whatever, we're going to have loading events and other things happening that are going to affect that layer. And the Swiss actually did work on one layer that they clocked over time, where they added load, and you have all these factors then. So you add load, and that's going to shorten your crack length, and then the weak layer is going to stiffen, or the slab's going to stiffen, and that's going to lengthen that layer back out. And I think ultimately how these surface hoar layers get stronger is the longer they're in the snowpack with enough of a load on top of them, is we're going to mechanically push the surface hoar into the layers above and below it, and that's going to slowly mechanically strengthen that layer. I mean, as practitioners, you probably realize that the best way to get rid of a surface hoar layer is probably load it up with a whole lot of snow, back off of everything for a while, and over time then give it enough time and it'll strengthen because you've got enough load on top of it. If you load it very slowly, they stay sensitive for a really long time. So anyway, I don't know if that's really much of an answer, other than the fact that it would be really nice to be able to do more controlled work of exactly how long it would take these things to stabilize. But it's really an interplay of all these different factors in terms of when you're getting the loading, what kind of layer you have above it, below it, and how much that surface ore gets pushed into those layers and things like that. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, it does answer. We don't know how long they last. A couple of months is my guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing is,
Interplay.
The other thing is, I wonder if you could provide some plans for your scientific cardboard box.
Oh yeah, no problem. That's very high tech. You know, you go into your recycling bin, pull it out, and I'm actually, you know, the first research we were just doing it at a regular PST length, so 100 centimeters. When I was working in Europe, they're doing a lot longer propagation saw tests. So there we just did 120, and then all I do is I just mark around on the inside of the box different centimeter heights, and so you just push it into the snow and then down to a specific line, and then you can fill in the snow up to certain layers and kind of smooth it off with your hand or a crystal card, and away you go.
Great, thanks, Karl. We have one last question, I believe, Brent.
Yes, one last question from David Miller, and let's try and keep it a little bit tight there, Dave.
Hi, Karl. Thanks for your presentation, and I've really enjoyed watching the evolution of these studies on the PST, and I was just curious about your thoughts on the rate of loading, and if I imagine you load pretty quickly onto this block, and if you were loading slower over maybe a day or a couple of days, how this may affect your results.
Yeah, no, very, very good point. Essentially, when we're doing this loading, you know, we're adding, you know, tens of millimeters of water weight, equivalent water weight over the course of 5 minutes or something. So the loading rate that we're putting the snowpack under is really, really, really rapid. And your point is spot on in that if we added that load a lot more slowly, then we're not going to push that. You know, essentially we're treating that loading as almost instantaneous, and then seeing what the recovery is from that. If we added that load a lot more slowly, then we probably wouldn't push that critical crack length as low as quickly as we do.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everybody for your questions. That was awesome.
Great. Well, thanks, Karl, for joining us. It was a great presentation. I'm interested to see how the work continues and to follow the cardboard box on its adventures.